I watched the blue light of my wife's watch illuminate the ceiling like a silent alarm telling me my life was a lie. The name on the screen belonged to a ghost from our past, a man she promised was gone forever before we brought our children into this world. Now I realize that while I was building a home, she was building a back door for the man I should have destroyed years ago. The weight of 5 years and 2 children felt like a heavy chain around my neck as I sat in the darkness of our bedroom in Seattle. Clara was breathing softly beside me, her sleep undisturbed by the betrayal vibrating on her wrist. The name Liam flashed again. It was a name I had purged from our lives during the turbulent months of my divorce, when Clara and I first started our journey together. Back then, Liam was a lingering shadow, the man she was seeing before we became serious. I remembered the confrontation in the lobby of our office building, the way he looked at me with a smirk that said he knew something I didn't. Clara had chosen me. She had deleted the apps, blocked the numbers, and told me he was a mistake of her past. I was a fool to believe that a mistake like Liam ever truly stays in the past. My career as a systems architect for a global logistics firm has taught me one thing above all else, which is that every secure system has a vulnerability if you look close enough. I had spent my life building impenetrable networks, yet I had left the gates of my own family wide open. I reached out and touched the screen of her watch. The message was brief. It mentioned a meeting after his football match around the corner. It mentioned catching up after Christmas. It was casual, familiar, and utterly devastating. It was the tone of two people who had never stopped being a part of each other's lives. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the cold streets of the city. My mind began to catalog every late night at the office she had claimed over the last month, every weekend run that lasted an hour longer than usual, and every time she had hidden her phone screen when I entered the room. The signs were there, like lines of bad code in a corrupted program. I just hadn't wanted to read them. The history between Clara and Liam was not just a brief dating stint. It was a competition I thought I had won. When we were co-workers, the air between us was thick with the kind of tension that ruins lives. I was mid-divorce, vulnerable, and looking for a reason to believe in a future. Clara provided that reason. But Liam was always there, messaging at odd hours, showing up at our social circles, claiming a territory that he refused to relinquish. It took a formal ultimatum from me and a public rejection from her to finally end it. Or so I thought. Finding that message felt like a physical blow to my chest. It wasn't just about the potential for an affair. It was about the calculated nature of the lie. She had bumped into him 3 weeks ago while out with her work friends. She hadn't mentioned it. She had exchanged messages about their lives. She hadn't mentioned that either. And then the ultimate betrayal. She had arranged to meet him while she was out on a run. A run meant to keep her healthy for our children was instead a cover for a clandestine meeting with a man she knew I despised. I looked at the watch again. The screen had gone dark, but the memory of the words remained burned into my retinas. I felt a coldness settle over me that had nothing to do with the winter air. This was not the time for a screaming match. This was not the time for tears. If the foundation of my life was being dismantled, I would be the one to control the demolition. When Clara woke up, I was already dressed and sitting in the chair by the window. I watched her stretch, the morning light catching the wedding band that I had paid for with 3 months of overtime. I asked her why her watch was lighting up the room so late at night. I watched the micro expressions on her face, the slight flicker of the eyes, the tightening of the jaw. She was good, but I was trained to spot anomalies. She told me she had bumped into Liam. She said it like it was a mundane occurrence, a piece of trivia about her day that she had simply forgotten to share. She said they were just catching up on life and that it was not an issue. I began to dissect the conversation right there in the morning light. I led her down a path of questions, giving her enough rope to hang herself. I mentioned that the watch showed more than just a casual greeting. I told her that the timing of the messages and the plans to meet after his match didn't look like just being friendly. She became defensive. She called me paranoid. She used a history of my previous divorce to suggest I was carrying trauma that had nothing to do with her. It was a classic redirection, a way to make my legitimate suspicion look like a personal failing. I didn't take the bait. I simply watched her lie. It was a fascinating and horrific sight to see the woman I loved manufacture a reality that didn't exist. I went to work, but I didn't focus on the logistics of shipping containers. I focused on the logistics of my own survival. I realized that the message I saw was only the tip of the iceberg. When I checked her watch again before leaving, there was a new notification. It was from WhatsApp, but the content was hidden. It said, "Waiting for this message. This may take a while." As a systems architect, I knew exactly what that meant. It meant she had deleted the app and reinstalled it, or she was using a new device, or the end-to-end encryption was still syncing because the conversation was massive. It was a red flag that screamed of hidden archives and secret folders. She wasn't just talking to him, she was managing a secondary life. I spent the day in a state of hyper-focus. I didn't feel the anger yet. I felt the thrill of a hunt. I had spent 5 years being the provider, the husband, and the father. I had been soft. I had been complacent. I had ignored my instincts because the alternative was too painful to contemplate. But the alternative was now my reality. I told her later that day that I was deeply concerned. I told her that after the turbulent start of our relationship, any contact with Liam was a breach of our core agreement. I told her I wanted her to block him, to delete the number, and to send a final message telling him to never contact her again. She agreed, but she was annoyed. She made it seem like I was an overbearing tyrant who was stifling her social freedom. But then I saw the watch again that evening. Another WhatsApp message from Liam, and again the same status, waiting for message. It was a loop of digital deception. She was telling me she was blocking him while the encryption keys were still dancing on her wrist. She was lying to my face while the evidence of her betrayal was literally strapped to her body. I realized then that I couldn't trust anything she said. I couldn't trust the tears or the reassurances. I was dealing with a compromised asset. In my world, when a system is compromised, you don't try to fix it while it is still running. You isolate it. You observe it. You gather all the data until you have enough to shut it down permanently without losing your own files. My children were asleep in the next room. They were the files I couldn't afford to lose. Every decision I made from this moment forward had to be about their protection. Clara had brought Liam back into our orbit, a man who had already proven himself to be a disruptor. She had opened the door to a predator and then lied about the locks. The next few days were a masterclass in internal discipline. I played the part of the slightly mollified husband. I let her think that her explanations had worked. I watched her carefully as she handled her phone. She was more cautious now. She never left it face up. She took it with her to the bathroom. She changed her passcode. What she didn't realize was that I didn't need her passcode to see the patterns. I began to monitor our home network traffic. I saw the pings to the WhatsApp servers at 3 in the morning. I saw the spikes in data usage when she was supposedly at the gym. I saw the locations of her phone pings when she was on her runs. She wasn't running through the park. She was stopping for 20 minutes at a time near a residential complex 3 miles away. I searched for the address. It was a modern apartment building with a view of the Sound. I checked the public records for the tenants. There, in black and white, was the name Liam. He hadn't just moved back into her life. He had moved into a luxury apartment within running distance of our home. The scale of the betrayal began to take shape. This wasn't a chance encounter at a bar. This was a coordinated relocation. Liam was back in Seattle, and he was back for Clara. And Clara was facilitating it with a level of precision that made me realize I never truly knew the woman I married. I looked at the photos of us on the mantelpiece. Photos of our wedding in Hawaii, photos of our daughter's first steps. They look like artifacts from a civilization that had been destroyed by a silent invader. I felt a surge of cold fury, but I pushed it down. Fury is a heat source that can be detected. I needed to be absolute zero. I started a new file on a private server that no one in my house could access. I titled it Project Reconstruction. It wasn't about rebuilding the marriage, it was about rebuilding my life after she was gone. I began to scan our financial records. I noticed small withdrawals of cash that didn't add up. I noticed charges for high-end lingerie that I had never seen. I noticed a second credit card that was being paid off from a secret savings account she had established before our marriage. She was preparing. She was building a nest egg for a life that didn't include me. She was using my salary to fund her exit strategy while using my home as a base of operations. The disrespect was so profound that it transcended mere infidelity. It was a total war on my dignity. I realized that if I confronted her now, she would play the victim. She would use the children as shields. She would claim I was controlling and abusive for monitoring her. I would lose everything in a messy divorce, fueled by her lies and my lack of concrete, undeniable proof of a long-term plan. I needed to see what was behind those waiting for message notifications. I needed the full transcript of her secondary life. I needed to see the depth of the rot before I could cut it out. I spent my nights learning how to bypass the specific encryption lag she was experiencing. I wasn't just a husband anymore. I was a digital forensic investigator in my own bedroom. I watched her sleep, and I realized that the person I loved was gone. Or perhaps she never existed. Perhaps she was just a sequence of behaviors designed to secure a stable life until the man she actually wanted was ready to take her back. The thought was a bitter pill, but I swallowed it. I would not be the victim of this story. I would be the architect of the aftermath. The WhatsApp message on her watch finally loaded while she was in the shower. I caught a glimpse of it before the screen timed out. It said, "He has no idea. We are safe for now." Safe. She thought she was safe. She thought she was playing a game with a man who didn't know the rules. She didn't realize that I was the one who wrote the code. I stayed in the bedroom, my face a mask of calm, as she came out of the bathroom wrapped in a towel, smiling at me with the eyes of a stranger. I smiled back. It was the hardest thing I have ever done, but I knew that the next time she went for a run, I wouldn't be watching her from the window. I would be waiting for her at the finish line. The Saturday morning in Seattle was thick with a fine mist that clung to the windows of my SUV. I sat 3 blocks away from our house, watching through a pair of high-powered binoculars as Clara stepped out onto the porch. She was wearing her expensive black running gear, the kind that costs more than a weekend getaway. She looked radiant, disciplined, and entirely focused. She stretched her calves on the steps, checked her watch, and began a light jog toward the park. It was a picture of suburban health and domestic stability. If I hadn't seen those messages, I would have been inside making pancakes for our kids, admiring the woman I thought was my partner. Instead, I put the car in gear and followed her at a distance that felt like a betrayal in itself, though I knew the real betrayal had been signed and sealed months ago. I kept 3 cars between us, navigating the winding streets of our neighborhood with the practiced ease of a man who had lived here for a decade. Clara didn't look back once. Why would she? She believed her husband was a predictable variable in a settled equation. She thought my early morning work shifts and my obsession with system architecture made me blind to the organic chaos of human deception. She was wrong. Architecture is about understanding how things are connected and where the stress points lie. I was simply applying my professional skills to the structure of my failing marriage. She didn't head for the main trail of the park. Instead, she took a detour through a residential alleyway that led toward the modern apartment complex I had identified earlier. My heart was a steady drum in my chest, not from exertion, but from the cold clarity of confirmation. I watched her slow to a walk as she approached the back entrance of the building. A man was already there, leaning against a silver sedan. It was Liam. He looked older, more polished than he had 5 years ago, but that same smirk was etched into his features. It was the look of a man who enjoyed taking things that didn't belong to him. I pulled into a supermarket parking lot across the street and adjusted my optics. I watched as they spoke for a few minutes. There was no hesitation between them, no awkwardness of 2 people who had just reconnected. Their body language was synchronized, a dance of intimacy that had clearly been practiced in the shadows for a long time.
Liam reached out and tucked the stray hair behind her ear. Clara didn't flinch. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a brief second. In that moment, the 5 years of our marriage, our 2 children, and every promise we had ever made seemed to evaporate into the Seattle mist. I took photographs, not because I needed them for my own heart, but because evidence is the only currency that matters in the court of public opinion and the chambers of a divorce judge. I captured the way she laughed at something he said. I captured the way he handed her a small, encrypted-looking key fob. I captured the kiss. It wasn't a passionate movie kiss. It was something far worse. It was a domestic, familiar peck on the lips that signaled a long-standing routine. They weren't just having an affair. They were living a second life. I watched her jog away 10 minutes later, heading back toward our home to play the role of the tired but energized mother. Liam watched her go for a moment before getting into his car and driving toward the downtown core. I didn't follow him. I didn't need to. I had the location, I had the visual confirmation, and I had the timeline. Project Reconstruction was now fully operational. I sat in my car for a long time after they were both gone, listening to the rain tap against the glass. I realized that the woman I had been living with was a ghost, a carefully constructed avatar designed to keep me compliant, while she worked with Liam to dismantle everything I had built. When I returned home, Clara was in the kitchen, blending a green smoothie. She looked up and smiled, her face flushed from her run. She told me the air was wonderful and that she had hit a new personal best for her 5-mile loop. I stood there, looking at the woman who had just kissed another man in an alleyway, and I felt a strange sense of detachment. She wasn't my wife anymore. She was a security threat that needed to be neutralized. I asked her if she had seen anyone interesting on the trail. She didn't even blink. She said she had seen a few of the regulars, but mostly she just stayed in the zone with her music. I went down to my basement office and locked the door. It was time to dig into the digital grave she had been digging for us. I accessed the private server I had set up. I had managed to intercept the synchronization of her WhatsApp messages by mirroring her watch notifications through a secondary bridge I created on our home network. The messages were finally loading. Thousands of them. The logs went back 6 months. They started with a casual message from Liam on LinkedIn, a professional reach-out that quickly migrated to encrypted platforms. It wasn't just about sex. It was about a coordinated plan. Liam had lost a significant amount of money in a failed real estate venture in California and had moved to Seattle specifically because Clara told him she could provide the capital for a new start. My capital. I began to track the money. Clara had been slowly siphoning funds from our joint investment account, small enough amounts to bypass the automated alerts I had set up, but significant when totaled over half a year. She was also using her position as a senior marketing director to funnel contract work to a shell company that I now realized was owned by Liam. She was literally paying her lover with our family savings and her company's budget. The audacity of the scheme was breathtaking. She wasn't just betraying our bed, she was committing corporate fraud and domestic embezzlement. I spent the next 6 hours mapping out the network of accounts. Every dollar she moved, every message she sent, every meeting they scheduled was now logged on my server. I felt like a god looking down on a miniature world of ants, watching them build a hill that I was about to crush with a single step. I found a folder in her cloud storage that was hidden behind a triple-layered password. It took me 3 hours to crack it. Inside were copies of my own financial records, my life insurance policies, and a draft of a divorce filing that would leave me with nothing but the clothes on my back and a massive debt. She was planning to serve me the papers on our 6th anniversary. She wanted to use the children as leverage, claiming that my long work hours and technical obsession made me an absentee father. She had even started keeping a journal of fabricated incidents where I was supposedly emotionally distant or unstable. It was a complete character assassination, meticulously documented to ensure she got the house, the kids, and the massive alimony settlement that Liam would then use to rebuild his empire. The coldness I had felt earlier turned into a diamond-hard resolve. I wasn't just going to divorce her, I was going to ensure that when the dust settled, she and Liam had nowhere left to hide. I began to draft my own set of documents. I contacted a forensic accountant I knew from my professional circles, a man who didn't ask questions as long as the fees were paid in crypto. I told him I needed a full audit of the shell company and the money trail. I needed it to be bulletproof. I needed it to be the kind of evidence that a district attorney couldn't ignore. I realized then that Liam wasn't the mastermind. Clara was. She was the one who invited him back. She was the one who designed the financial architecture of their new life. Liam was just the muscle, the handsome face she wanted to see across the dinner table once I was out of the picture. She underestimated me. She thought I was just a systems architect who cared about code and servers. She forgot that I was the one who designed the systems that kept people like her from breaking the world. That evening, we had dinner with another couple, the Millers. They were old friends from my university days, and they looked at Clara with the kind of admiration people reserve for perfect spouses. Clara was at her best, telling stories about the kids and talking about her upcoming summer vacation plans. I sat there, nursing a glass of bourbon, watching the performance. It was flawless. She leaned over and touched my hand, telling the Millers how hard I had been working and how much she appreciated everything I did for the family. I looked her straight in the eyes and said that I had been doing some deep cleaning of our home systems recently. I mentioned that I found some old files that I thought were deleted but were actually just hidden in the background, consuming resources. I watched her hand twitch on the table. It was a fraction of a second, a tiny glitch in her programming, but I saw it. She asked what kind of files. I smiled and said just some old legacy data from the time we first met. Things I thought we had moved past but were still taking up space. The rest of the dinner was the exercise in psychological warfare. I dropped small, sharp comments about the importance of transparency in architecture and how a single hidden vulnerability could bring down an entire skyscraper. I talked about a hypothetical case at work where an employee was funneling money to a competitor through a shell company. I saw the color drain from her face, but she kept her smile fixed. She was a professional. She was a predator, but she was starting to realize that the prey was looking back at her with teeth of its own. When we got home, the tension in the house was a physical weight. She didn't go to bed immediately. She went to her home office, claiming she had some emails to catch up on. I knew she was checking her hidden folders. I knew she was messaging Liam, telling me that I was acting strange. I watched the traffic on the monitor in my basement. She was panicking. She was trying to move some of the funds back into the joint account, but I had already placed a stealth freeze on the transfers. The system would show the transaction as pending, but the money wouldn't move. I sat in the dark, watching the lines of code scroll across my screen. I was no longer a husband. I was a liquidator. I had already contacted a specialist in parental rights, a woman who specialized in cases of parental alienation and domestic fraud. I gave her the journal Clara had been keeping, the one I had copied from her cloud storage. I told her I wanted to ensure that my children would never be used as pawns in a game of greed. The plan for the exposure was taking shape. It wouldn't happen on our anniversary. It would happen much sooner, and it would happen in a way that ensured there was no path back for her. I began to prepare the delivery system for the evidence. I wasn't just going to give it to a lawyer. I was going to send it to the board of directors at her company. I was going to send it to the bank's fraud department. I was going to send it to Liam's creditors in California who were still looking for him. I went upstairs and found her sitting on the edge of the bed, her face illuminated by the glow of her phone. She looked up at me, and for the first time in 5 years, I saw fear in her eyes. Not the fear of a woman who was losing her husband, but the fear of a criminal who realized the police were at the door. I didn't say a word. I just got into bed and turned my back to her. I needed to be rested. The final phase of Project Reconstruction was about to begin, and it required absolute precision. She stayed awake for hours. I could hear her breathing, ragged and uneven. I could hear the silent pings of her watch as she desperately tried to find a way out of the digital cage I had built around her. There was no way out. She had built her new life on a foundation of lies and my money, and I was about to reclaim both. The blue light of her watch finally went dark, but the silence that followed was even louder. It was the silence of a world about to end.
The morning of our 6th anniversary arrived with a clarity that only absolute certainty can provide. The fog that usually blanketed the Seattle harbor was absent, replaced by a sharp, biting wind that seemed to strip away the remaining illusions of my life. I had spent the early morning hours in the basement office, watching the final data packets move across my screen. It was the digital equivalent of a funeral procession. Every piece of evidence, every message, every transaction was now safely stored in 3 separate locations, encrypted with keys that only I possessed. I had already initiated the final stage of the protocol. The dossier I had sent to the board of directors at the marketing firm where Clara worked had been received and acknowledged by their chief compliance officer. I didn't ask for a meeting. I simply provided the raw data, the account numbers, and the proof of funds being diverted to a shell company owned by a known financial disruptor. The corporate response was a silent, mechanical execution. Her professional credentials had been frozen, and their internal audit team was already dismantling her career before she even finished her morning coffee. I watched Clara as she prepared for our celebratory dinner. She was humming a song I didn't recognize, her movements fluid and confident. She was wearing a deep emerald dress that I had never seen before, likely another purchase made with the funds she had diverted from our children's future. She came into my office and kissed the top of my head, telling me how much she loved me and how excited she was for our evening together. I felt a cold, clinical interest in her performance. It was like watching a high-end simulation that had a fatal error in its core logic. I told her I would meet her at the restaurant, claiming I had a few last-minute emails to send for a project. The project was her total liquidation. I waited until I heard her car pull out of the driveway before I made the final calls. The first was to the private security firm I had hired to monitor Liam. They confirmed he was at the airport, checked in for a flight to Cabo that Clara had booked using a hidden credit card. The second call was to a contact in the local police department who was very interested in the evidence of interstate wire fraud I had uncovered. The restaurant was one of those places where the silence is as expensive as the wine. It overlooked the dark waters of the harbor, the lights of the city reflecting on the surface like scattered diamonds. Clara was already seated when I arrived, looking every bit the successful, happy wife she wanted the world to believe she was. She reached across the table and took my hand, her touch feeling like a foreign object against my skin. She toasted to our resilience and to the many years ahead of us. I let her speak, watching the way her eyes brightened with the thrill of her own deception. She believed she was moments away from securing her future with Liam. She thought her divorce filing was the surprise of the evening. I allowed her to enjoy that delusion for exactly 10 minutes, the time it took for the first course to arrive. I reached into my bag and pulled out a sleek silver tablet instead of a gift box. I told her I had prepared a digital retrospective of our journey, something to mark the transition into our next chapter. Her smile was wide and expectant. I tapped the screen and showed her the first slide. It wasn't a wedding photo. It was the incorporation documents for the shell company she had used to pay Liam. I watched the blood drain from her face in real time. It was a fascinating physiological response, the body realizing the danger before the mind can fully process the defeat. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke with the calm authority of a man reading a technical manual. I walked her through the transactions, showing her the exact moments she had moved money from our joint accounts into Liam's pocket. I showed her the messages they had exchanged while I was at work, the ones where they laughed about my predictable routine and my supposed blindness. The second slide was even more devastating. It was a live feed of the message I had sent to Liam's primary creditors in California. I had informed them of his current location and the fact that he was attempting to flee the country with embezzled funds. I told Clara that Liam wouldn't be meeting her at the airport. He had been detained at the security gate 20 minutes ago. The look of terror in her eyes was profound. She tried to reach for her phone, but I told her it wouldn't work. I had remotely wiped her devices through the home network earlier that day, utilizing the administrative access she had forgotten I possessed. She was now digitally isolated, her connections severed, and her reputation in ruins. I laid the divorce papers on the table, the ones that specified my demand for sole custody and a total waiver of alimony based on her documented criminal activities. Clara began to sob, a jagged, desperate sound that didn't move me in the slightest. She tried to play the role of the victim, claiming that I had driven her to this, that my obsession with work had left her lonely. I reminded her that loneliness doesn't involve complex financial fraud or the planned abandonment of one's own children. I told her that the house was being listed for sale the following morning and that the locks were being changed at that very moment. I had already moved the children to my sister's house in a different state, and a temporary restraining order was being processed based on the evidence of her unstable financial environment and her association with a known criminal. She had tried to burn down my life to build a playground for her lover, and instead she had only succeeded in incinerating her own existence. I stood up and left the restaurant before the main course was served. I didn't look back. I didn't need to see her face when the reality of her homelessness and her impending legal battles finally settled in. I walked toward the harbor, the cold air feeling like a baptism. I reached into my pocket and pulled out her smartwatch, the device that had started this entire process. I also took off my wedding ring. I stood at the edge of the pier for a long time, watching the black water churn against the wood. I threw the watch first. It disappeared into the depths with a small, insignificant splash. Then I threw the ring. They were just objects, components of a system that had failed and been replaced. I felt a sense of peace that was absolute. I had defended my territory and protected my legacy. The woman I had loved was a ghost, and the ghost was now gone. I returned to my car and drove away from the harbor, heading toward the mountains. I had a new system to build, one based on security and the lessons I had learned in the darkness of my own bedroom. Project Reconstruction was over, but my life was just beginning. The silence in the car was no longer heavy. It was the silence of a clean slate, a world without back doors or hidden vulnerabilities. I was no longer a victim of a partner's choice. I was the architect of my own fate, and the structure I was building now would be impenetrable. I watched the city lights fade in the rearview mirror, knowing that by the time the sun rose, the life of the woman who betrayed me would be nothing more than a cautionary tale in a corporate audit.